Okay. Hello and welcome to the Sprint 164 Manage IQ review. This was a regular 2-week sprint. I'll give the overview. Kavya will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Jason on the platform, the API, and the developer experience. All right, so this sprint we had our pull request merge went back up from a low of last sprint. And while our pull request opened, trended down a little bit. So it seems like it's matching roughly sprint 161. And I'm hoping as we have more people working on the project that these numbers will start trending upwards as we go forward here. In terms of the split, 25 enhancements, 14 bugs, 20 refactorings, and the rest sprinkled around. With that, I'll turn it over to Kavya.
Yep, thanks, Oleg. Good afternoon, everyone. This sprint total 6 PRs got merged into UI repos, 1 bug, 3 enhancements, and so on. Next slide, please. This is a bug simulation page, has some CSS issues, and whole left-hand section got displaced. Fixed that. Next slide, please. Adam added CPU and memory hot add checkboxes in VM provisioning. He might have more information on it in the provider section. Next slide, please. This is one of the important enhancement that got merged in this sprint. Before, storage has 2 submenus, block and object storage. Now both got combined into one. Next slide, please. Just added a few more screenshots as a continuation here. So if you notice, now it has only one managers, and both in the table it has both block and object storage managers, and it uses same create form too. So in the drop down, you'll get providers which has capability of storage, and fields will populate based on that selection. Next slide, please. Here, this is an enhancement. Neither DDF nor Carbon has a multi-select with select all component. So we worked on a custom component which has multi-select and with select all option. As a part of one form conversion, we are working, but it turns out that we don't need that multi-select component there. But anyway, as we spent some time on this, we added code for it and raised PR. So that in future, if we have this requirement in our form, it's ready to use, and it has a minor bug. Other than that, it's good to go. That's all in UI. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Kavya. So for providers in the core of this sprint, we improved the provider refresh spec helpers. These spec helpers generally help with when you're running comparisons between, for example, full and targeted refresh to make sure that nothing changed. They actually do full diff comparisons to the database, so move some of the commonly used accessory methods up into core so that we can delete a bunch of methods which are duplicated in some provider specs. We also refactored a bit of how the inventory refresh classes are built. The IBM provider in particular has to customize the class names for their refresh, and so this change in core allows them to do that. We fixed a couple of supports feature blocks which had the wrong feature name, so it actually, the block which added unsupported, the name of the feature that it was marking as unsupported was different than what it was actually checking, and so it would accidentally mark the feature as supported. So I think there were 3 or 4 that we fixed there, and that came out of PR review from Oleg's PR set, which is finishing converting all of the VM features from the old validates methods to the new supports features, and so you can see a number of those, and at present, all of the VM actions are converted over to supports features, which is great. Next slide. For Openstack, we improved the exception message if you add credentials which return a 401 unauthorized. Previously, the error message indicated that either the username or password was incorrect, but it's actually possible to have a bunch of other things cause that error. For example, the domain ID could be wrong. And so it was misleading, indicating the user that either their username or password was wrong when it could be a few other things. So we made that error message a little bit more general. For Rev Overt, we fixed the Overt Network Manager STI types. We fixed this a few sprints ago in the refresh so that new records that were created had the proper class names. This is just a schema migration to fix previously created records. For VMware, as Kavya mentioned, this was actually a request from one of our community users. He was requesting that when you provision the VM, it would be great if you could set the CPU and memory hot plug properties. Essentially, after the VM gets created, you can only change these by powering down the VM and then reconfiguring it, which isn't great for production machines because it incurs downtime, obviously. So what we did here is when you're provisioning the VM, you can optionally enable these properties on the VM when it gets provisioned. For some reason, they aren't carried over from the template. It's either a bug in VMware or maybe they had a reason for it, but they were essentially lost. And so this should make it a lot easier for people to enable this. And this lets you change memory and CPU on the VM without having to restart it after the fact. We also finished combining the Cloud and Network Manager refreshes for VMware vCloud, which is a more efficient way of doing the refresh. We also fixed a bug in the storage manager for vSphere. If there was a PBM default capability profile, we didn't have that parser defined, and so the refresh is failing. So we fixed that up as well. Next slide. So on the IBM Cloud side, Nasser added the ability to delete VPC VMs. We previously had the power operations supported, but not destroy. So this also enables retire to destroy the VM properly. He also went through and added targeted refresh support for, we started out with VM refresh, targeted refresh, but then he went through and just nailed out all the other collections that VPC has. So in those set of PRs, he added targeted refresh support for everything the VPC refreshes. If we go over to the next slide, I'll turn it over to Nasser, and he has a short demo of the VM targeted refresh.
Thanks, Adam. Yep. So just as a preface, targeted refresh is desirable because it takes significantly less time and significantly less compute time as a full refresh. So to demonstrate this, I was retiring a VM instance and then performing a targeted refresh on the VM. And this showcases a relatively quick power state change due to the short refresh. So as you can see right now, the refresh is taking place. And then just in a few seconds, we should see the power state change to powering down. And yeah, so that's the refresh. And so that was relatively quick compared to a full refresh. Whereas in a full refresh, we would have to wait anywhere upwards of 30 seconds or more, obviously depending on the size of the inventory to see the power state change. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'll turn it back to Adam.
Thanks so much, Nasser. That was awesome. And that is it for providers this sprint. Over to Jason.
Okay. On the platform side for enhancements, as Kavya mentioned, we have a new block storage capability and some of the collapsing work that was involved that was needed in core. Adam also made a schema change to collapse some of the product features. I added the what's called a prog name to all loggers. This is a feature of the Ruby logger that allows you to say what the actual something detailed about the logger. Where this is useful is when you go to container logging, you can actually filter the log messages by which log you care about. Nick L added verify SSL to the embedded Ansible configuration script source. Previously, we just did verify none, but now backend support was added to choose whether or not you want to verify SSL or not. And in an upcoming sprint, we will be adding something to the UI. Nick L also added the rack attack gem to the application. This allows for via the API or the UI, limiting the number of requests within a certain period of time for security reasons. Keenan moved the appliance initialization from the build to the appliance repo. What this allows it to do is on boot of the appliance, we will initialize first time instead of doing it as part of the kickstart, which allows him, this is part of his work to remove root from our appliances. And finally, I added some more PRs to the move to CentOS Stream, in particular in ManageIQ pods, which now gets our containers using CentOS Stream where necessary. For bugs, LJ or Joe fixed a issue where we were identifying the replication type. While in normal production scenarios, this wouldn't happen because you have a separate database for the global region and a separate database for the remote region. But during development, sometimes you want to use the same database for replication or the same database instance. And when they were in the same instance, the methods that verify whether or not you're a global or remote were inaccurate. So this fixes that bug. And finally, I fixed a bug where the internal HTTPD server that we use inside the UI worker used the default request field size, but if a user changed the outer size, it wouldn't be reflected on the inner size. So a request that came through that was too big, but the user wanted to allow through was still not allowed through, and it was rejected anyway. So this expands the internal HTTPD server's field size to the maximum amount so that it will honor the user's external HTTPD limit request field size. Next slide, please. One other bug fixed was by Kavya. She fixed the CSP fonts issue. This is part of the secure headers that we use, but it didn't allow fonts from gstatic.com, which is Google's static font server. So before this PR, you get a lot of warnings and errors inside the console, and after it's all cleaned up. Next slide, please. On the doc side, Dan worked on updating navigation paths to reflect the current UI. As we've reorganized some of the UI, some of the documentation was off. So he went through all the documentation, fixed a lot of that. And Connor fixed some terminology that we're using where we're moving toward browsing instead of navigating. Next slide. And over to Jason for the rest. On the enhancement side, Adam, again, worked on the block storage stuff. So this is another PR that goes toward that full effort. And for bugs, Nick L fixed an issue where when you do an options call on any API, none of the strings that came back would be localized because we don't use user auth. So that he added a feature that allows optional user auth. So if a user is logged in and has a locale, the options calls will return in their localization. Next slide, please. And finally, on the developer side, Joe had a really great change to make our migrations faster, and I'm going to turn it over to him to talk about it.
Hello. So just as a summary, ManageIQ supports central administration through remote databases replicating tables to the global. Migration code ensures that the remote databases are migrated before the global. And so we looked at the code that was tracking this information, and we identified it as being slow, and we optimized it. Some of the changes included getting the list of already run migrations only once for the one migration that uses it. We use raw SQL inserts and deletes instead of active record, heavy model, find, creates, or deletes. Additionally, we got the existing subscriptions only once and cache it instead of getting it for each migration. In addition, we also did migration logic for the up direction when you're migrating to the latest schema, when you were doing the reverse, when you were actually migrating down. So there was no reason to do that up logic while going down. So some of the results we found was, at least on my local machine, was migrating up from an empty database saves around 60 seconds, from about 100 seconds to 42. Migrating down back to an empty database saves around 40 seconds, from 70 to 27. As a side effect, this actually saves a few minutes on each ManageIQ Travis build since we need to set up the database. In addition, other repositories on Travis also need to migrate a ManageIQ database, so they'll also see an improvement. The primary reason we were looking at this was Podify deployment was slow. And so this saves about 90 seconds for Podify deployment, from about 350 to 260. Thanks to Nick and Jason for lots of suggestions and reviews. That's it. Back to Jason.
And that's it on the developer side.
All right, and that brings Sprint 164 to a close. Next one is in 2 weeks, July 7th. And with that, I want to thank everyone, the speakers, the contributors, the community, everybody involved in helping make this sprint a success.